As you guys know, we have the AAME job board, jobs.aame.org. It is absolutely free to post any of your senior executive level recruitments. It's free for recruiters, it's free for cities themselves. However, if you would like to have those jobs included in my newsletter, which goes out to 10,000 subscribers every week on LinkedIn, especially if you're trying to reach those passive candidates, right? Those prized passive candidates that aren't actively looking but are reading my newsletter for news and information about what's going on in the profession, you can put those listings in the newsletter for $199. There is a link on the AAME job board, the pricing page. Just click that, and you will see the $199 posting in order to get those listings in the weekly newsletter. All right, all right, all right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America. And with me today is a good friend of mine, someone I've been wanting to have on the show for quite some time. His name is William Bryan Daly. He is my former police chief in the city of Sedgwick. I hired him on. He was my very first hire as a city manager, city administrator in Kansas, and it was one of the best decisions I'd ever made in my life. And I'm really excited to have you on the show, Brian. Why don't you give a quick little background on your career progression, and we'll unpack it a little bit as we move forward.
Yeah, so interesting enough, I started my career off, at least the law enforcement side, like most people in small town Kansas, and managed to progress through the different various ranks. Ultimately ended up in the Wichita metro area where my family was originally from, in a larger department, and then was presented with a very, very unique opportunity that I got to go overseas. I went overseas as a private military contractor working in Afghanistan, had an opportunity to train Afghan police and kind of help rebuild their Afghan police force. It was a great opportunity, very lucrative. It was an exciting time for me. And then when I came back from that, I found myself back again with the one skill set that I had. I was in law enforcement. I knew I wanted to get into law enforcement administration, but like many things, just like city management, you kind of need the title to get the title, and I didn't have it. And so I took a job with a small police department where I was working while I was trying to make a decision if I was going to go pursue a career in academics, trying to maybe teach at the police academy if that became an option, or if I was going to try to find an agency that I would ultimately take over as the chief of police. And that is about the time that Joe Turner came into my life.
Yeah, yeah. A game changer, right?
It absolutely was.
Game changer for me, game changer for you. Let's unpack this for a second because, Brian, like I've told people this numerous times in person and private, if I could clone you and take you with me in my hip pocket to my next city manager gig or whatever, I would do it a million times over. We had an amazing experience working together. It was really enjoyable. It was a lot of fun. We got a lot of good stuff done. And I just want to kind of unpack that a little bit, how that whole thing came to be, because it was so fortuitous and it almost didn't happen. And the reason why it almost didn't happen is because I had a lot of internal and external pressure on me to make this police chief hire. It was my very first person I was ever going to hire under my leadership. I had gone through a high-profile situation of terminating my police chief within the first month of me being there. And so for a small town, the microscope was on me a little bit. And we'd done the first recruitment attempt, and I did not like the candidate pool. And my mayor was pressuring me to fill the seat and fill the spot. And I'm like, hey, I don't want to fill it with the wrong person. I think that's taking a step back. And then your resume came across my desk, and I was like, oh, this guy looks interesting, with your military background and overseas contract work and so forth. And we had a conversation on the phone, and everything was going great. And I was worried because I'm like, why the hell is this guy going to come work for the city of Sedgwick when he was making a crap ton of money as a contractor? And so for a lot of people who are listening have no clue how low the salaries are or the hourly wages are for law enforcement personnel in Kansas. It's really ridiculous. And at the time, Brian, you were making about $18 and change. I forget the exact amount per hour to be a law enforcement officer.
Yep.
And I could barely pay like $21 an hour for my police chief.
And what's absolutely crazy is my time overseas contracting, my salary range for that work greatly exceeds probably what I will make for a considerable period of time, even as a city manager.
Yeah, it makes you made more than a lot of city managers.
So it was very easy to look at my resume and say, why would you make that kind of money to be willing to come here for this kind of money?
And I didn't have the luxury or desire to hire somebody who was just going to bail in 6 months. So I was really concerned about how long term you were going to be in this role. That was my main concern. And so, we had this phone call, and I was like, man, I really like this guy. I need to get to the bottom of this. Is cut to the chase. I'm a guy who likes to take action, seize the moment. If I really want something, I go after it. And you were working, like I said, small town Kansas. You were working the night shift, and I was working a normal shift. And I
don't think Joe ever works a normal shift. So
that's fair enough. Fair enough. But I drove my ass out to you. I don't know, probably got there at 1 o'clock in the morning, 12:30 or something like that. And we had probably a 2.5 to 3 hour conversation, I think, talking about.
And I can honestly tell you, I've never told you this before either. I walked out of that conversation when you departed thinking, God, this is going to suck if I don't get this job, because this is the guy I want to work for. Because I knew immediately you and I were both aligned career progression wise and had a very, very common view of how the future was going to
It was love at first sight, dude. I felt the same way when I left. I was like, this is my guy. I want to hire him. And honestly, the big deal was I needed to figure out whether or not you're going to be there for the long term, as far as what your career ambitions were, what your
and I think we were always, that's a very important point. I think you and I were both very upfront about what that looked like.
Yes.
Because I don't want to leave the impression that my goal was to go to Sedgwick and be there forever and retire in that seat. That was not the case, and I think we communicated that.
Absolutely. So, your goal, as you say to me, was that you wanted to be a police chief. And I had told you that my goal was to be a city manager, but to jump up to a much larger organization at the time was my goal. And I said, so I'm basically a couple of years ahead of you on the path. I have the title now, and I told you very plainly that, hey, this is a stepping stone job for me. I have no problem, and I fully expect Sedgwick to be a stepping stone job for you. In fact, I hope it is a stepping stone job, because if you don't think it's a stepping stone job, then you're probably not the guy I'm really trying to find for this position.
Absolutely.
Right. And I said, hey, hitch your wagon to me. I'll hitch my wagon to you. And you win, I win, you win. We're going to be successful, and we're going to help each other get to where we need to go. And I told you I was going to support you 100% in your career goals of going to become a police chief of a large organization. And at the time, Sedgwick only had 2 full-time officers and a handful of part-time officers. I mean, that's the big culture shock thing for me, Brian, moving from California, is this whole idea that cities don't have 24/7 police coverage.
And Sedgwick was an interesting animal, because it was, you can still look at the structure of it and think, well, that's not a great move as far as a career goes. But at the same time, just like city administration, city management, I had to get that title on my resume. And the only way you're going to get that title on your resume is to accept a position somewhere. It may not be the one that you initially thought you were going to take. You talked about, your first round, second round of applicants, and me coming in the second round. And that was part of the equation too, was like, is this the right city? Is this the right size?
Well, you told me in the past that you actually looked at that position and you thought about applying, but you said, you thought, nah.
Nope. Yep. And, it was one of those things. Later I started looking at it and saying, I need that transition role. I need to take that role on so that I can move to the city that I want to move to. I need to get that title on my resume.
Yeah. But again, and you can't overstate this, because it's so important to have alignment between the city administrator and department head or whatever's going on when you hire somebody. I gave you my full-throated support. I said I was going to 100% back you up and try to get you there and make you as successful as I could be. And, the amazing thing is, what I loved about you, Brian, is, and the way I felt like we complement each other so well, is that we're both extremely curious, inquisitive people. Like, we ask questions until other people want to slap us upside the head because they're tired of answering our questions.
I remember Mayor Chapman more than once being like, "You too."
Oh, poor Mayor Chapman. We gave him we gave him some gray hairs, that's for sure, because we were a pretty intense duo, that is for sure. But what I loved about having you with the city of Sedgwick is you ended up becoming a pseudo quasi assistant city manager without the title. I mean, you didn't come at the job with a lot of police officers can have a very narrow, myopic sort of tunnel vision focus on just their department. Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that if that's their career goal and that's where they're going to be and that's what they want to do. But through my entire career, I've always been the guy that's like, okay, I know what I'm doing, but I'm kind of curious about what you're doing too.
Super curious about that. Yeah.
And every time that I can countless examples when I'd go in Joe's office and be like, hey, Joe, I want this. And Joe would be like, why? Show me how. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And then the whiteboard and then the dry erase marker. And I knew I was in for a lecture. And we would break it all down. And I'd like to think, at least on a couple occasions, I kind of got my way. But a lot of times what I really got was a better understanding of what we needed to do and how we needed to do it.
Well, and I think we established this relationship of trust because I just didn't say no because I said so. Didn't do the mom or dad, to the little kid treatment. I would articulate why I didn't feel it was. And I've always, I think you'll agree. I've always praised or complimented myself on being open to differing viewpoints and oppositional viewpoints because at the end of the day, I want to make the right decision for the taxpayers, and I know you do too. It's not about my decision or my opinion. It's about what is best for the taxpayers, and that's ultimately going to be the winning formula.
Right. No, and I think obviously our relationship evolved in the period of time I was there because in the beginning I would ask for something or tell you that I was looking to do something and I would get a little bit of skepticism. And then as time went on, I got less skepticism as you began to realize, okay, we truly are aligned on our vision. We really do have the same goals.
And what I really loved about working with you, Brian, is that more often than not, we were in alignment, through convincing or talking to each other, explaining our perspectives, and we would see eye to eye. And there were a few times where, you and I didn't see eye to eye. You disagreed with me or whatever.
Absolutely.
But to your credit, once the decision was made, you never undermined that decision. You never sabotaged that decision. You said, okay, that's it.
Yep.
And
That's the same way that
I
think
a good soldier.
At city administrator, city manager role, you do the same thing with the governing body. You go in there and say, hey, here's all the information that I have to offer you. Here's what I think is the way forward. And then the governing body, as representatives of the citizenry, says, this is what we want to do. And then that's the direction we go.
Yeah.
So I'm often asked about Joe. And one of the things I always say about Joe is like stepping on a Lego in the dark. Brian is like stepping on a Lego that's had the edges rounded off just a little bit. And I've had more than one person that knows both of us just shake their head in complete agreement. So,
hey, guilty as charged. Guilty as charged. So I ended up punching out of Sedgwick and going to South Hutchinson. And that opened up an opportunity for you to be the interim city administrator there for a while.
Yep.
And then you had to make a decision to essentially leave the organization to pursue your career path.
Yeah, so that transition was actually kind of interesting. So when Joe left, I actually took over. I didn't necessarily take over, but assumed many of the responsibilities and kind of helped out with the day-to-day functioning of both the police department and the city at large. And then the city opted to go hire a traditional city manager candidate.
I
wouldn't say traditional, but yeah.
He had no experience.
So yeah, they brought in a full-time individual to fill that vacancy.
But this person they thought had a good finance background.
Yes. And so while they had some skills and acumen that would help them towards the job, I think the bigger picture of the totality of the job was just not necessarily well suited for them. And unbeknownst to that individual, I was still performing many of the functions that would have been their responsibility had they assumed the job completely. And then ultimately that individual left the city within a very short period of time. And then I was presented with the opportunity to take over in the interim role, which I did.
Yeah.
And I continued in the interim role for a little bit until I had the opportunity to look at other city manager vacancies, city administrator vacancies. And now having that on my resume, I was far more competitive.
Yeah. So you go to Medicine Lodge.
Yes.
And man, you were doing really well, gangbusters there. You're having a really good experience. And there's a but coming. But walk us through a little bit of how that experience went. You were hired in, I think I want to say November of 2022 or something like that, right?
November 2022. And I was there until March of 2025.
And you got raises and five-figure bonuses.
We'll talk about how that all came about. But I was receiving bonuses every year in excess of 10%. And every time I received one of those bonuses, it wasn't just simply coming out of the budget. It was literally coming out of massive amounts of savings where we were clawing back some funding, where we were finding additional savings. In every way, those bonuses were paid for.
You were earning it.
Merit-based. Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%.
And it was a really great experience until it wasn't. And I don't know how much we're going to cover on this for this episode or how much you feel comfortable, but the reality is that you were in talks to get a significant raise and things were going hunky-dory. Yep.
But it was dragging out.
Yeah, well, to put it in context, in November of 2024,
that's your 2-year anniversary.
Yep, I receive yet another bonus, well in excess of 10% on my base salary, and we start the negotiations to talk about what the contract's going to look like. And Joe and I had conversations, and Joe said, "Hey, get this done."
What did I know.
I kind of drug my feet because I thought, well, there's some other opportunities out on the horizon, and I want to take a look at them and see what might materialize. And then as we started to move forward in that process, we come along February, it's finally time to get this thing locked down and get that contract prepared. I'm preparing sample language, and I share with my governing body at that time that I am interested in looking at other opportunities, that I have already started applying at some other opportunities, but I'm not opposed to staying if they're willing to adjust the compensation to make that.
Truth be told, you wanted to stay. You were happy because we talked about. I'm going to say this, Brian, because I consider myself, without hopefully being too arrogant, a little bit of a mentor, right? Getting you into the profession and what have you. And we've talked about your career path, and I said, hey, this first job, put your 2 years in and bounce.
Yep,
right.
You did.
I
just had so many projects, and we'll talk about those projects. So many projects that were going so well, and just a great opportunity.
And they were going so well.
Yes.
You said, Joe, I want to see these to the finish
Yes.
line. So you wanted to stay in Medicine Lodge, but it was dragging out in the contract negotiate.
We talk about wanting to stay there. Yeah, there was a lot of things that I liked about Medicine Lodge, but I also knew career-wise I needed to move on, and I was dragging my feet because of that. And that's,
I know, but that's because you were, and I don't mean this in a bad way. This is where you and I are a little bit different. Like, you were really emotionally invested in seeing some of these projects come across.
There was
the
some
finish
loyalty
line.
to these projects.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I was like, hey, you are making a late career change into this profession similar to me. You put your 2 years in. You did great work for them. You got great value. You saved them thousands and thousands of dollars, which we'll unpack here in a minute. And I go, dude, you need to take care of yourself and bounce, right? So anyway, the contract negotiations drag out, which I tell people all the time, you should never let that happen. You need to seize the moment and get that done. You've earned it. You should be rewarded. And then this opportunity comes open, which wasn't open in November. It was not. If they would have got the contract with you hammered out, you wouldn't have been looking. But this opportunity comes open, and it's a significant increase in salary and a significant increase in organizational size and complexity.
Yes.
And so you were under the impression that everything's hunky-dory. You have a really good relationship with this council, right?
I did, but at the same time, and I think it's important to discuss, I also had some transition in the governing body. So anytime you see that happen, you get new governing body members that come on board, the dynamic changes, it shifts.
Yes.
You weren't necessarily their pick in the beginning.
All the more reason why to get that thing done.
Maybe you've sent some code violation letters out to some individuals, and now they're on the governing body. There are a number of things that change over time.
And so I will say it, members of the council kind of got butthurt that you were looking elsewhere, and things which is very common. I've profiled these stories numerous times.
Feelings get hurt, unfortunately. Yeah, and this is, we obviously work with people, and so as a result, people have feelings, and people's emotions and feelings become part of the process.
Yeah, and they're not always based in logic.
No. I mean, we can get back into the whole concept of how many organizations look at loyalty. Like, if you're willing to live in the community, they want you to establish residency. They want you to be all about that community. They want to know that you're going to be there till retirement. And that's not the case for all of us.
No, and the loyalty is often not a two-way street.
Right. I tend to look at my job is to do the best possible job I can do for the city.
Yeah,
that's it.
Absolutely, 100%.
Right.
So the first one I really want to talk about today, Brian, is the insurance, the general liability property insurance that cities have for their equipment, for their buildings, and what have you. Because this was something that I'd seen in Sedgwick that I'd found was a very lucrative way of bringing value to the organization. And then you went to Medicine Lodge and put this on steroids and took it to a whole new level. And I really think, and you agree, that looking at your insurance coverage and reviewing it and analyzing it thoroughly is one of the easiest, no-brainer, low-hanging fruit things you can do as a department head or as a city manager to really demonstrate value or produce value for your governing body, for your city, for your taxpayers. You correct?
Oh, absolutely. But, I was just listening to your podcast with Mike Grabanowski talking about how you're looking at projects, your CIP projects and contractors, and it's the exact same process. It's the exact same thing here, only applied to the insurance. When I worked with you in Sedgwick, you often referred to it as our top ramen mentality. And those that don't know anything about Sedgwick, Sedgwick was, in the years prior to Joe and I's arrival, actually in the red.
They literally, shortly before I arrived, they had to hawk the road grader to the local bank just to get enough money to make payroll for the end of the year.
So as you can imagine, Joe was a little bit hard when it came to the budget.
And I grew up poor. I went to college.
Literally
Top ramen was a thing for me.
So I spent my formative years in Sedgwick under Joe, just living penny by penny, making sure we paid attention to what we spent and how we spent it. So I bring this mentality when I come to Medicine Lodge. And when I get there, it's a couple months have gone by. I'm settling in and I'm looking at things. My insurance agent comes to me with our new premiums and I'm thinking, wow, that number is high.
So much more than what we're paying in Sedgwick.
Exactly. And I'm looking at, these are the same population. There's some differences in infrastructure, but that number's out of whack. I mean, out of whack by like 2/3 out of whack.
Yeah.
So I'm like, something isn't right here. And so I go looking at the numbers and I can see where the percentages have increased over the years. And by themselves, the percentages, when you're told, hey, your premium's going to go up, blah, blah. But at the same time, I'm like, man, this just isn't adding up. So I start breaking out the policies and I start rolling back and I start seeing crazy swings in the valuation on some of the properties that we have. So then I start going back even farther and I go back as far back as 2013. And that's when I found one of our first real big issues, and aside from the valuations, but at one point, somehow our city shop had gotten cloned in 2013, our insurance. And what's really interesting is, and I've had this conversation a number of times, there were 2 city administrators before me and 1 city clerk that ran through that entire period of time, all professional. I don't want to in any way make it appear that they missed something.
Denigrate them right like that.
Yeah, because they were top-notch people that paid attention to the details. This particular detail you'd only find if you really went digging into it.
But see, here's the thing. So there's paying attention to the details, right? But when it comes to insurance, there is a lot of different angles or ways that you can get worked over on your insurance policy.
Absolutely.
And so what happens is, invariably, I would bet, is that these insurance policies, there's the modest adjustment on an annual basis that's chalked up to COLA or just increase in rates. But really, there's not much of a deeper dive beyond that.
And that's where
you need to be going.
That's exactly what happened. They were being told.
And one more thing too, because I don't know how you're going to get into it in Medicine Lodge, but I can tell you within Sedgwick and my experience in South Hutch, where I had EMC for the insurance. Sedgwick was different. I was Berkshire Hathaway when we were in Sedgwick, and then when I went to South Hutchinson, it was EMC. And in both cases, they don't break out piece by piece everything on a dollar point to add up to your premiums. So what they do is they just give you line items of equipment and buildings and valuations, and then you get the summary sheet, and you have no clue how they add it. It's like a black box.
No,
and so you really need to dig into this by actually requiring your insurance agent or whoever your broker you're using to say, hey, no, I want this broken out piece by piece so I can do the math and see where these things are adding up. Right?
Yeah, I'll say even though in the beginning, though, this is such low-hanging fruit that even in the beginning, just looking at those general numbers is going to give you so much insight. And what's even more funny is, like I said, I talk about how my predecessors, very, very competent people, just didn't catch this because they didn't drill down into the details in the way that I ended up ultimately drilling down into it. And since then, I've had this conversation with countless city managers and administrators who all tell me the exact same thing. Oh, no, I've looked at that. I'm aware of what's going on. And I can't guarantee it, but I have a pretty strong feeling that my predecessors would have told you the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And until you actually dig into these numbers, you don't know. And what was even crazier is, as we were digging through our numbers and I finally get our insurance agent to acknowledge that they have a pretty significant problem, he starts looking at some of his other clients that are also municipalities and starts finding similar duplicated phantom properties as well, and crazy valuations. And we'll talk about valuations here in a second, how crazy some of these were.
And what's wild about this, Brian, is we're talking about Medicine Lodge, a city of about 1,700 people, Sedgwick, a city of about 1,700 people. We're talking about a low 6-figure, high 5-figure annual insurance bill, right? So we have city managers. We have department heads who listen to this show who have bigger budgets than the cities that we manage, right?
Absolutely. But the concept remains the same.
It remains the same. And again, there is so much room for inspection and analysis. And I would virtually guarantee everybody listening to this podcast, they're going to be able to find something to save in their insurance policy, whether it comes to reviewing the equipment, because there's so many instances where, for example, in Sedgwick, let me back up. What you have to fundamentally understand when it comes to your insurance is nobody out there has a vested interest in reviewing your equipment and property and making sure that is being assessed correctly or billed correctly.
Right.
except you.
Right. And I'll tell you what's
And so
even funnier.
if you don't do it or staff doesn't do it, it doesn't get done.
And I'll tell you something. You talk about the attention to detail. When we were going through our process, because we ultimately ended up switching insurance carriers, and when we did that, we started actually going through piece by piece what we were actually insuring. And then you would find on a much smaller scale, but it was very prevalent, that we were insuring equipment we didn't have.
Yes.
And we were not insuring equipment that we did need to be insuring. And these are, sometimes this was vehicles, sometimes it was just high value tools. But
the other thing too, Brian, because at Sedgwick, I don't recall us insuring anything that we didn't have as far as equipment. What was very common in Sedgwick and was also somewhat common in South Hutch was that we would be insuring vehicles and equipment at basically the brand new cost or without any depreciation or whatever.
Right.
And so and what happens is on those items, the insurance is only going to give you the actual value of the item at the time that it's lost.
Right.
So you're paying for 100% of the value and you're just throwing money away.
Yes.
Period. Completely insane.
The bottom line is if you're not taking the time, particularly with insurance, but obviously, like I said, we talk about this with anything, but insurance is the easiest piece. If you haven't taken the time to break that spreadsheet down and look at what each particular piece of property is insured at, what its coverage limit is for each year, and then trending that year over year, you're not seeing the errors, and they're there. I mean, in our case, we had at least 6 properties that had increased between 2018 and 2023 in their valuation over 1,000%.
It's just incredible.
Yes.
And that's not only do you have to look at massive increases in valuation, because here's the other thing too, is like, anyway, you can hide these increases in valuation with these big policies. So it's like it's easy to kind of get lost in the shuffle.
We had 2 instances, and again, they were both kind of crazy. Both involved storage units, right? So we have a storage shed at our animal control facility. And this is basically just a 10 by 10 shed, dirt floor. It's just used to store some dog food and a few small things for the animal shelter. This is the building that today you can go down to Lowe's. You could buy this thing for $6,000-$7,000, brand new, way nicer than what we had.
Way nicer, yes,
right?
Yeah.
So in 2018, that particular shed is insured somewhere in the range of about $5,000. In 2023, it's insured for about $90,000.
And there's no justification for
No,
it.
and unless you went into each of those properties and broke them down and looked at it, you wouldn't have caught it. And I know everybody's going to be listening to this and thinking, "Oh, this is common sense." I would notice that. You probably haven't, and I feel very confident saying nearly everybody listening, if they have not specifically broke down their policies and looked at it piece by piece, they're doing this themselves.
Yeah.
In this case, our particular carrier made a change allegedly in their software in 2018, and that's why we started seeing these crazy valuations. I mentioned earlier we had a duplicated city shop. So if our city shop was duplicated and it's an identical copy,
When you say duplicated, you mean that somehow along the way you're going to pay insurance for this building.
Yes.
Building A. You're paying, whatever the amount is for whatever the valuation is, and then next year magically building A is on there twice.
Yes. Same address, same description.
Now, here's the crazy thing, right? Because people, like you said, people say, we check our insurance like that.
Right.
Nobody from the city of Medicine Lodge called up the insurance carrier and said, hey, by the way, we have a 2 building A now.
No, but I think everybody looks at it and says, oh, this just must be, I must not understand this.
Yeah.
They've done something. So our building gets cloned in 2013. Our building stays the same between 2013 and 2018. We're paying the same amount, the same valuation on both buildings. Until 2018, we see this divergence, and they begin increasing in values at different rates, which makes absolutely no sense if they're the same building. If you're applying insurance metric to this, it should appreciate at the same value, right? But it didn't. And it didn't just appreciate at a small value. It was one of the properties that was radically going up. I think it, over a 5-year period, one of them had increased almost 270%. The second one, which got to a slower start in its appreciation, ended up, I think, around 170% of its original value. And this was absolutely insane.
That's incredible. And so,
and what's even better
I'm going to put you on the spot, Brian. I don't know if you feel comfortable. So what does the insurance company, insurance broker, agent, whoever you're dealing with, what did they say when you bring this up to them?
Well, it's funny. The shed was one of the best examples, because in the very beginning, we're like, hey, this shed. They're like, oh, these buildings go up in cost. This is where our carriers or our underwriters really are tearing our agents. All these things go up in price, and we use this metric, blah, blah, blah. He literally, because I remember the conversation, says, well, if it burns down today, are you going to pay him $90,000 for a $5,000 shed? And then we got, well, we can make that adjustment. I was like, okay, that's great. But how about the rest of the adjustments?
How about a refund?
Right, which we ultimately did get on the city shop building and some of the other properties as we kind of started pushing back on that. But my favorite part was...
So you were able to claw back.
Yes, we clawed back.
Can you explain that process then? Because they don't just voluntarily say, hey, we want to give you the money back,
No,
right?
they did not. And in fact, they tried to argue, well, you should have called this to our attention. And then there was a mention of the insurance commissioner. And then magically things seemed to be going a different direction.
I mean, in all fairness, to some degree, there should be some checks and balances from the customer. Right?
Yeah,
I
but
get
check
all
this
that.
out. This is
but it's like your job. I mean, your job should be, hey, having systems in place that don't automatically duplicate buildings that don't exist.
But you know who should have been my advocate in this? Is my agent.
Your agent,
right?
Yes.
But my agent isn't. This is like, I think of it a lot like real estate. You know, you have your agent, the seller has their agent.
Does the agent make more money if you pay higher premiums?
Yes. Do they not? Isn't that crazy? And then, you know, the other part of this...
They don't get paid for saving you money,
yeah,
right?
The part that always struck me odd is I'm literally talking to our underwriter and I'm saying, hey, you guys going to send someone out here to look at these buildings? Oh, yeah, we send people out to look at these buildings. I said, oh, wonderful. So you're telling me since 2018, twice, you've sent somebody out here and they physically looked at the two city shops. And they're like, well, you know, we send someone. No, let's back up.
Yeah.
Do you have photos of both city shops? Because I've lost one and I'd like to get paid for it. And so it was
right.
Yeah, it was a series of unusual conversations. You're like, it just
because they want to go through the mental gymnastics of not trying to pay you or reimburse you, but then you say, okay, well then how about you really pay me then?
Yep.
Right.
And so when we started really pushing back, we clawed back enough that it was equal to a single year's worth of our premiums up front. And then we got back some of the other ones when they started going back and looking at the valuations.
Now it is fair to say, if we're being intellectually honest here, though, that had this been caught sooner, you would have saved a lot more money because they didn't go back.
Yes.
They didn't go back 10 years and give you every year's worth of savings for everything that you found, right?
No. So yeah, without going into a whole lot of details, a certain portion of it was covered by the underwriter, and then our insurance agent actually ended up having to make some of this whole himself.
Okay.
So, but the city was made whole for the whole process.
Okay. Good deal. Good deal.
And that was a big win that year because, I mean, like I said, that was a significant.
So what's a dollar amount on that? Can you put like a rough dollar amount for a city of your size? What that translates into?
It was over six figures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge for a city.
I mean,
that
just
size.
to get that lump sum back into your general fund when you weren't expecting it.
Yeah, it's like free money.
Yeah.
In a way. I hate to say that word because obviously it wasn't free when you paid it, but
right.
Yeah.
But we applied the same approach, and we can talk more about that. We applied the same approach we put towards insurance, towards everything. I think you have to take the time to look at every single thing you're doing. If you've been doing something more than 5 years, you need to go take a look at what you're actually spending on it.
Yeah.
You know, another, just albeit very minor example was our swimming pool and chlorine. And I was, again, looking at the cost of chlorine. I'm like, this is significantly higher than what we were paying in Sedgwick. This doesn't make any sense to me. So I start looking, and I find I can literally purchase, because we were using a style of chlorine that you could purchase from retail locations, and we were paying more for it than what I would have paid for if I just bought it from either a retail location or ordered it off Amazon.
It's crazy.
And so we immediately made some adjustments there, saved some money. And that we applied that across multiple departments. There's always that mentality of this is the way we've always done it. And every single person I ever talked to says, oh, I hate that. That's the way we've always done it. And I'm very much not that person. And yet they're very much doing it the way they have always done it. I saw it regularly when my police department and public works were using the same vendors over and over again. They'd call up, hey, it's time for bug spray. It's time for stickers for the police department. It's time for...
Well, it's the easy button, Brian.
Right.
It's the easy button, right?
And every time we would go back and look at any of those things that we've been doing for a couple of years, there was not just a little bit of savings, but significant savings.
Well, I would like to think that I put the fear of God in you a little bit when you were working with me on saving money and trying to mind our pennies, right, and save our dollars. So I think that carries over.
Yeah, I wanted to get... kind of an inside story, but I wanted to get a drone, and no one was going to get it if I saved some money. And Joe was not having it. Yeah, you or Mayor Chapman.
Yeah. You like to push the envelope a little bit. I think sometimes half those were just to try to put me on tilt and see if you can get a reaction out of me for the day. So,
but you know, it's interesting. We talk about. I may be going off in the weeds here, talking about technology. One of the things that we implemented in Sedgwick before I left, and then I ultimately brought when I came to Medicine Lodge, was utilizing some different types of technology as well to drive down cost. You know, we have a hard time hiring police officers, and we don't necessarily pay as great a salary to police officers we ought to be able to get them. But one thing we can do is we can offset that with equipment, both in terms of enabling officers to do a better job and as force multipliers. And I know you're not a giant fan of the license plate reading systems.
I'm not.
But we implemented those in both locations, and that legitimately offset having a lower number of officers available, because now you've got a system that is constantly monitoring the
Those were
roadway.
implemented after I left, I believe.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. So those systems properly managed, and I can't highlight that enough. I think we had policies in place. I think 100%. Everyone I had working for me, working on the systems, really paid attention to using those in an appropriate way. Even though after I left Sedgwick, there was an instance with the replacement police chief. I think anyone can find if they go looking for where those license plate readers were used inappropriately.
Yeah.
So the potential for abuse is there, but again, I get back to any technology, if you're willing to monitor it, can be a benefit.
I will say before we delve onto any other subject matter here, I just want to hit home on this, Brian, because I do think that one of my biggest assets and one of your biggest assets are things that you bring to the table. And this is something that I find one of the most important traits to look for in a new hire or looking for an employee, depending on the position. I mean, obviously. But I like curious people. I like working around people who are asking questions, who are just constantly drilling down to the first, second, third, fourth layer. Funny story, maybe, I don't know. I alluded to the fact that I terminated the police chief the first month I was there, which led to you having the opening for you to fill. And I was there for a week. This is literally the first week of my interaction with this individual, and I was peppering them with questions. And this individual was not used to being challenged or asked to support or with reasoning the different decisions that were made. Okay. And I would, drill down and ask a question, and then I would ask a question about that answer. And
I'm very familiar with the Joe interrogation process.
That's right.
I've told people this a million times. First few times I came in, asked Joe for something, Joe would ask me a question. I'd be like, I'll have to get back with you. And so I got to the point where I would come in and I would literally think out on a flow chart every single question that Joe could possibly spin off from the question that I was asking and have some kind of answer so that I was ready. Which is kind of funny because that changes your thought process, right?
Yeah.
I started looking at everything the same way, like, well, where's this going to go to? And how could this go to that? And then I expected the same thing from my department heads. Like, if you come in and ask me something, have some answers for me.
Absolutely. Be prepared. Right. Yeah. And so what happened was, the police chief and I got into a little bit of a he lashed out, let's just put it that way. And that was interesting for my very first week on the job. But I'm just asking questions in a non-accusatory way, and it was just, not received very well. But I would say that if you're a city manager and you really want to do right by your organization, you want to really get results, you want to change things, you want to be more efficient, hire individuals who are curious, or just cut straight to the chase. Why don't you hire Brian Daly? He's awesome.
No, we talked about this before. I think I've always had this approach of, I like to think of it as like the 3-year-old mentality. Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? And we went through 2 major projects that were one that we completed while I was at Medicine Lodge, and the second one that is ongoing, that were both heavily influenced by my 3-year-old mentality.
They're beneficiaries of.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the first instance, and we'll talk about that when we're ready to talk about, was a daycare facility.
Let's talk about now. Because this is literally one of the most innovative, resourceful things that you've done in your career. And it's literally, you've created a template or a model for other cities in Kansas to follow, right?
It's very interesting because the state of Kansas constantly loves to throw around their innovative approach to daycare, their innovative approach to solving these problems. And because we have a massive shortage in daycare.
And
when we came along with an innovative approach, it was outside the box, and it was uncomfortable for them. And I think I mentioned this before. God, I wish I could remember who I properly credit for this on LinkedIn, but I saw a quote about we have to challenge the status quo. We have to push back against it so hard that we actually break it. That city managers are entirely too comfortable sometimes. And you and I have talked about that.
Is that Brooks Williams, out of curiosity?
I don't recall who it was, and I really wish I could find it again so I could make sure I properly give that individual credit. But you and I talked about that a lot, about that feet up on the desk mentality that a lot of folks get there and they say, well, I've made it.
I've arrived.
Yeah. So
I'm comfortable now.
Right?
Delegate.
So I very much didn't have that mentality, and this daycare project came along. And my predecessor laid the groundwork for this, had entered into a partnership with a local philanthropist who, through a CDBG grant, we were administering to build this daycare facility. And if you know much about daycares are not nearly as profitable as you think. And that has a lot to do with the way that
let's unpack that. Let's unpack that for a second, because I don't think a lot of people understand that the way that the government has shifted towards pushing kids into preschool, that's really taking the highest profit margin kids that were in the daycare system that would subsidize the higher, more expensive infants and what have you. And so therefore now you have a lot of these daycare facilities who are left caring for the most intensive clients.
Yes.
Right. With the require the most burdensome sort of headcount, teacher to student ratio. And meanwhile, the K through 12 institutions have gobbled up all the really profitable kids that were the money makers for the daycare centers.
And beyond that breakdown, like you just said, there's obviously the aspect of the regulations are different if you're operating in-home daycare or a daycare center.
Yes.
So again, your ratios change. And that was one of the first questions that Brian started asking. Well, why? Well, why is it acceptable for me at home daycare to have 10 kids, but the same 10 kids, if I put them in a daycare center, now require 2 providers? Well, why is that? What's the difference? Are they less safe at the daycare center than they were at someone's random home?
Right.
And so we just kept working through those questions and, well, this doesn't make sense. And why does this? And we weren't going to obviously be able to change those regulations, but the question was what existed within the regulations that we could use differently.
And sometimes those regulations can be interpreted a different way.
They can be. And I think one of the big instance for us was really looking at how do we take, ultimately, I guess I need to back up a little bit. So this daycare project is moving forward. We have this philanthropist participating in it, realizes that it's not profitable, and decides that he's going to pull out of daycare. And at the same time he did that, prior to that happening, he had already consolidated almost all of the daycare in the community. He'd opened up a smaller daycare center. He'd gotten people to shut down their in-home daycares and come there in preparation for the larger daycare center.
So now there's going to be a massive void.
So we had a massive void, and we had multiple problems. First, I had to deal with that problem. Aside from the CDBG grant, I had to deal with that problem. And we were very fortunate. The city had a couple of vacant properties. And I used my public works guys as construction guys immediately to renovate those properties and get them ready so we could transition some daycare providers into those facilities to be able to meet the immediate
have some capacity.
need. Yeah, we're talking within days. We're moving these pieces to make this happen. And then we're looking at how do we save the CDBG grant? The city's already expended several hundred thousands of dollars. So if we agree that we're going to let this collapse, we're going to get a little bit back through the agreement that we have with the individual. But at the same time, we're not going to get enough of it back to compensate for what we've put forward. Plus, after you've defaulted on a CDBG grant, good luck in the future, right? So I'll go to the governing body and I said, hey, I have an idea. I think we can do this. I think we can assume the 501c3. And we worked through the process, and it was a very doable thing. But the big piece was, how do we operate a daycare? If we bring over a daycare and we're going to operate this daycare like a traditional daycare model, that means hiring employees. That means hiring a lot of employees. And in fact, it would have overnight become the largest department within the city if we did that model.
That's wild.
And it just simply wasn't viable, right? But we had a 501c3. And so we looked at the daycare regulations and the statutes in the state of Kansas and realized that we could operate individual group homes within the commercial setting. That also offered us the opportunity to take on some of the local providers that wanted to continue offering daycare but didn't want to do it out of their home, to offer them space in this building that was grant funded. And the city's real position was, if this isn't costing us money, it's okay, right? So we're not looking to turn a profit. We're just looking to recoup enough to be able to cover the operating costs, which we were able to do. And in turn, we now bring in 6 providers that are inside this one building, each of them licensed as an individual daycare, but under the umbrella of a 501c3.
I have this vision, Brian, because I don't know if you've seen it, like it's becoming more and more popular, these food court sort of destination locations, right?
Yep.
It's almost like this is like a food court destination for different daycare providers.
It was really. And I always kind of compared it to like a hair salon. Like each of them are renting their chairs, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, though, they were contract employees under the 501c3. But it was an interesting model, and the state did not like it in the beginning. And I shouldn't say they didn't like it. It was different. It was a radical departure. It was innovative, that word they talk about, right?
Yeah.
And it took a little bit of working to get through that. And then we had to work with the fire marshal's office. We had to make some changes to the way the building was designed.
Can you quantify the head count or capacity for the kids to give the audience a perspective on how significant this was for the community?
As a daycare facility, depending on how it was operated, and this gets into crazy regulations and ages of kids, the absolute maximum number of kids that facility could have housed was a little over 80. Under our model, it holds like 50-some kids.
That's for a town of 1,700 people. That's a lot.
It's very significant.
Yeah.
And so it was a unique opportunity. In fact, it was so unique that in the end, I was actually recognized in 2024 by the Kansas Association of City Managers.
Forgive me. I forgot to mention at the beginning of the show. Yeah. So why don't you articulate what was the award and what impact has your role in this project had across the state?
Well, so obviously the award was for taking on the leadership role, creating the space for daycares immediately, and then reworking the CDBG grant in such a way that we were able to continue the operation and make that work. But what was really interesting was after our model took place, after we did this radical departure from the way that it was normally managed in terms of daycare facilities, we had other entities, other municipalities, and other private groups that were coming to us and saying, hey, we want to do the exact same thing.
That's awesome.
And this is one of those times when what worked in Medicine Lodge might not necessarily have worked as well in Wichita. I mean, a daycare facility here is different than what a daycare is in rural western Kansas.
But even a variant of your idea could be taken and used for that local specific purposes.
Absolutely. When you start looking at how do we break this down, so instead of having to operate the entire thing, we're just basically operating the 501c3, and then under the 501c3, individual contractors are operating in their space. It made the whole process work.
But what I love about you, Brian, and I'm not to turn this into a a rah-rah fest for my buddy Brian here, but I mean, you could have easily just thrown your hands up and be like, "Hey, that's a daycare thing. That's not my job. I'm the city administrator here. That's someone else's problem. I got to stay in my lane over here and do what I'm going to focus on."
And that would have been the easy thing to do.
It would have been.
It would have been easy to say, "Hey, well, he backed out, so we're gonna collect a little bit of funding from this. We're out of the project. We're just done.
Let the residents figure it out.
And
right?
honestly,
let the market figure it out."
From the headache standpoint, that would have been wonderful because the daycare was it was a challenge until it was all ironed out. And I had governing body members who were like, "Hey, is this really what we want to do?" And I'm like, "Well, you're already this many hundreds of thousands of dollars into it.
Yeah,
it's cheaper, literally, for us to finish the project than it is to just give up on it." And so we had those conversations. But yeah, it's wild.
That's amazing. Congratulations on that, Brian. I was so impressed with you and what you're doing there on that front. And then why don't we segue to your experience with grants, because you've been very, very successful with some of the grants in the state of Kansas and helping the city out. I mean, you've really been able to maximize and leverage those funds. And I don't want to say they fell in your lap because that would be dismissing your work, but once again, this is another example of how asking questions and pushing the needle a little bit and the envelope and just not just taking no for an answer, right? Why don't you talk about some of these grants that you've worked on?
Yeah, I think probably one of the ones that surprised everybody, and I simply say it a lot of times, don't want to say it fell in my lap, but it kind of sort of did.
Yeah.
Only because we did the prep work for it. But we had an airport, and I don't know how many city managers and administrators have to deal with an airport. It's not the greatest experience, but it was a new experience. Coming from Sedgwick, we didn't have an airport. I landed Medicine Lodge, and not only am I a city administrator with an airport, I'm also the airport manager. So that was a wild experience. So one of the things we were dealing with right off the bat was this runway realignment. And when I get there, I start asking, well, why do we need to realign the runway? And I'm told, well, that the runway has to be realigned. It has to be shifted a number of degrees. The city had previously looked at relocating the airport as a solution to this problem, but that wasn't viable. So instead, they were postponing some of our improvement projects on the airport for some additional FAA funding that would require millions of dollars in order to basically tear out a runway, shift it a couple of degrees, and then build a new runway. And I kept asking, well, why are we doing this? And everybody kept saying, well, the runway's got to be realigned. I'm like, okay, yeah, but
why?
Why does the runway need to be realigned?
Okay, 3-year-old, right?
Yeah, and I heard all kinds of crazy stories about, well, this building was built, and then this was done, and then I'm like, okay, yeah, but still, you're not telling me why I need to realign the runway. The airport's there, it's working, airplanes are taking off and landing, nobody's hit the building, nobody's hit these other things, so what exactly? So we dig into it with our engineer, and this was not the engineer that had designed the runway realignment, but they too had just accepted that the runway needed to be realigned. And we had that conversation a number of times. I'm like, I would like to know why we needed to realign the runway. Well, realigning the runway presents a favorable approach for airspeed or wind or something. I'm like, okay, that's great, but do we have to do that? This runway's working fine.
For this amount of money invested?
Right.
Yeah.
So we dig through. And finally, ultimately, I get given an answer that it has to do with the approach and obstructions created from the ground. I'm like, okay, wonderful. So they bring out all the engineering plans and show it to me. And yes, in fact, the slope of the ground is within the approach angle of the runway. And because of that, it's a problem. And so we're going to move the entire runway in order to accommodate that problem. And I remember asking the engineer, like, well, how come I just can't go out there with a shovel and scoop the dirt out of the way? He's like, well, it's not quite that easy. I said, well, there's a giant hole on the other side of the airport. Why can't we just take a bulldozer over there and scrape that dirt off and then
move it over
and fill that hole in it and lower the ground? He's like, well, I guess we could do that. So we go back to the FAA, and the FAA looks into this and says, well, yeah, that's an option to solve the runway realignment problem. I'm like, so instead of spending millions of dollars and building a new runway, because that's what the architects and engineers had determined was their approach, we could remove the dirt. Well, the end result of that was now we needed to start looking at other projects, because in the airport management thing, you had to have some kind of viability. The airport had to have certain properties. You needed certain things to be happening in order to keep that runway front and center. And so I was hit up by our aviation improvement program and asked, "Well, we're going to submit anything for the current year?" And at that point,
When you say is this a state department?
Kansas Aviation System Program. Yeah.
Okay.
So they asked us to submit a proposal. I said, "Well, I don't have anything. Well, we'd just like to have everybody submit a proposal." I'm like, "Okay." So I called my engineer and said, "Hey, look, we're going to need some new lighting at the airport. We've got old incandescent lighting. We'd like to have some approach lighting. You guys help me work something out." And he's like, "Yeah, but we're still working through this grading project." I'm like, "I know, but I think maybe we pair this and we go ahead and submit it, because I think it's an important part of the way forward."
Now, if I'm tracking you correctly, Brian, based off of this conversation, previous conversations that you kind of shared with me, is you kind of submitted something just because you wanted to make them happy for being good partners and work. You didn't really have any really.
I'm getting some pressure. Why don't we have some submission for this? So I'm like, okay. So I submit it, and that gets even better. So we draft this whole thing up. They basically take a proposal they had. So we have a lot of the pieces already built. We wrap up this new improvement program, forward it onto the state. I get a phone call saying, "Hey, you guys are doing that grading project and some other stuff. This is just right now. This probably just isn't the time." I said, "Yeah, no, I understand. I was trying to help you out. I was trying to submit something like you asked me to do. Like, okay, great, no problem. Just as long as you understand, don't get your hopes up that you're
no expectations.
Yeah, I know I'm not going to get it." Month goes by, and I'm literally driving to work when I hear about the awards that are being awarded. And sure enough, the City of Medicine Lodge gets over $500,000 for lighting.
No kidding.
And I get a phone call later from the state saying, "Yeah, we don't know exactly how, but you got your funding." So.
So Brian, let me make sure I got this correct. You saved the city $100,000+ on the insurance.
Yes.
And plus, I don't even know what the annual reoccurring savings would be, because that's just clawing back 100,000 plus.
And
plus
so
annual
reoccurring.
reoccurring.
And we actually ended up changing insurance agents and carriers, and our insurance premiums were 2/3 what they were before.
So ballpark, how much is that? Would you say roughly?
That's about another $60,000 a year.
Okay. All right. So you got $100,000 one-time clawback savings, plus $60,000 a year or so reoccurring.
Yep.
Okay. You save about 50 seats of capacity for the childcare system in the city, which is desperately needed.
Yep.
At no cost to the taxpayers.
Correct.
Okay.
It's actually turning a small little bit of reinvestment money.
Then you get $500,000 in grant money, plus you save millions of dollars on just asking questions about this realignment project at the airport.
Yes.
Right. And this is just 3 items we've talked about in the 2+ years that you were there.
Yes.
At Medicine Lodge.
Yep.
But God forbid you decide that you want to earn a little bit more money or get a raise or put your hat in the ring because they've dragged out your contract negotiation. Congratulations on all that amazing work you're doing, Brian. Obviously, I'm so proud of you, and I'm a big fan, big cheerleader of what you're doing. I want to ask you something before we kind of wrap up this interview, and that is this transition from wanting to be a police chief to city administrator. It was a big change. I'm kind of curious, what have you enjoyed most or found the most exciting or challenging or different or unexpected about that transition into city management as opposed to being a police chief?
Not really sure how to answer that question. I have always been the kind of person that's looking for the next challenge. I also like to fix broken things, which was kind of one of the exciting things about coming to Sedgwick. The police department was broken.
It was rough, yeah.
And so we managed to do a number of things. We not only did we rebuild the police department, rebuild credibility, we brought new equipment in, looked at ways to get some of that equipment funded.
Amazing turnaround.
Yep. So we had new equipment when I left across the board.
It was virtually a state-of-the-art department.
It was. In fact, we even also renovated a building. Yeah. We took an old dilapidated building, started off with it was going to get a facelift. It ended up being a complete renovation. Time it was said and done, purpose-built for the police department. And we did that in-house.
Yes.
We brought our public works folks in to help with some of the construction.
And you served as a project manager essentially for that.
We had a lot of folks that contributed to that, and a project that had we sent it out to the typical design build model would have cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we came in, I want to say our total cost was around $85,000.
And this was in our downtown historic district to keep that,
absolutely beautiful area. That was restored, and then an area adjacent to it was restored into a small pocket park that has continued to be developed by their current administrator and it's just a wonderful addition to the community.
Is that what you think you enjoy most about the city administrator, city management life? Is that just no days the same? Is there so many different things?
I think that's probably got to be it for me. I like the challenge. I'm not that guy that can come in, sit down, and put my feet up on the desk and say I've arrived, so I don't have to do anything else.
Yeah.
I very much want to fix things, and then once those things are fixed, I want to go find other things that either need to be fixed or can be made better. Because at the end of the day, every single thing that I did at Medicine Lodge was really about making it better, making it more efficient. I mean, a good friend of ours, obviously Mayor Chapman, great guy. I don't know how many times I heard him say, citizens don't mind paying taxes as long as they get something for those taxes.
Yeah, they feel like it's not being frittered away on nonsense.
I've always kind of taken that philosophy that my goal is to make sure that I'm doing the best job I can with the resources that I have and making them work for the community the best possible way they can. And you can't sit around and let those resources be squandered. Citizens see that, and they deserve better than that.
Surprisingly, we find ourselves in having this interview at a time that you are not working. You're looking for your next gig, your next opportunity. I'm just sort of dumbfounded that decision was made, obviously, especially in light of everything you've done with that community.
Feelings get hurt.
Yeah. What are you looking at now as far as your next step? Are you looking at staying in Kansas? Are you looking at exploring other areas? Or walk me through what your mindset is.
I'm actually really excited about this. I mean, so my departure from Medicine Lodge obviously included the typical severance package, which gave me the opportunity to take some time and look at what the next best opportunity is for myself. And
your young growing family.
Yeah. I mean, I've looked at opportunities here in Kansas. I've looked at opportunities in other states. And, I've always had a propensity to want to go to another state. I've talked about that. And that's put this well within the crosshairs. And now I have the opportunity to take my time, look and find the city that really meets my needs, that I'm a good fit for, they're a good fit for me, and there's some kind of future there for.
Are you, I was joking around about, cloning you and hiring you if someone had the opportunity to do it, or if I had the opportunity. Are you interested or open to the idea of doing an assistant or deputy city manager role, or you pretty much want to stay at the top and run the organization?
It depends on the size of the organization. I think you and I had a conversation about that one time when you told me you were taking an assistant role, and I thought, God, Joe Turner's an assistant. That's going to be, that's going to be rough. And I think that...
And it turned out to be rough, but not for the reasons that we expected.
And I think that could be true if I were in too small of a city.
Yeah.
But I've looked at a lot of some of the assistant manager positions in cities when you're getting into that 30, 40,000 range. In terms of population, you see the assistant really has dedicated roles.
Yeah, and a lot of resources, a lot of latitude, a lot of autonomy.
Yep.
Depending on the manager, obviously.
So I'm open to the idea. And in fact, I've actually put my resume out there on a couple of those.
Okay. Well, I guess that'll wrap this up for us, Brian. I mean, I really appreciate you coming over to my home, sitting in my dining room and doing this recording. I've been wanting to have you on the show for quite some time. I just, like I said, think the world of you. I think you're an amazing administrator. I think you're so talented, and I think there's a lot of cities out there that would be very lucky to have your services in the near future. So I'm looking forward to see where you end up, and looking for bigger and better things for you in the future.
Awesome, Joe. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. I'm Joe Turner. This is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. If you like the content, please hit that follow, subscribe button on your platform of choice, and please leave a rating or review on your platform of choice. Catch you next week.